Hello, Newview Trust. Thank you so much for joining for another Tuesday webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about trust and estate planning for your IRA with our very special guest, Mr. Tim. And if you want to introduce yourself real quick.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Tim. I work partnerships for a security benefits center. We're a company out of Grand Rapids, Michigan. I've brought along our resident expert, director of estate planning, Ben Smith.
And we thank them so much for being here. They're going to answer some really great questions that we've had for quite a while now. So disclaimer, Newview Trust serves as the custodian. We are not a tax expert, legal expert. We do not sell investments or give investment advice. We'll always tell you to go seek to a professional, but we do custody ESAs, HSAs, HSAs, and 401ks that hold alternative assets that are directed by the client. So what is a self-directed IRA? As always, a self-directed IRA is just a marketing term. An IRA is an IRA, but it's able to be self-directed, meaning that you choose all of the investments inside of it, and you can go on beyond traditional stocks, bonds, and mutual funds to be able to truly diversify your portfolio. Also save money on the investments that you're already making and investing in what you know best. They always say that you're going to get the best return when you're investing in what you know best because you know the market, you know what's expected, and you know how to do your own due diligence. So questions, today is going to be a question and answer style. So we're going to be answering the experts' questions, and they're going to be answering all these questions that we have. So number one, what are the potential benefits of using a trust as the beneficiary of the IRA?
So overall, when we're building out a trust, there's a variety of different things that are really about as customizable as you want them to be. And so typically, if we are sending assets like an IRA or Roth IRA, or even as simple as life insurance through a trust, there's a very specific reason we're doing it. Usually it's related to how that asset is actually being distributed out to our beneficiaries. So inside of that trust, we would theoretically could have different rules or age limits on when that money can actually be accessed. That's usually one of the bigger reasons why we'd want to fund an IRA into a trust. We don't necessarily have to all the time. Different states can have slightly different laws, so you always have to make sure you understand what your state specifically has laid out. But for example, in Michigan, like for Tim and I, we can pass assets like a Roth IRA or like a traditional IRA outside of probate still, as long as we have our beneficiaries set up properly and they're legal people. So if we were putting it directly through the trust, we're probably doing that because we maybe have minors or we've got a few kids who aren't 18 yet, or maybe we just don't think they're quite ready to take on an inheritance yet, which is a pretty real concern. With a lot of the people that we tend to meet with is they don't want to leave a large sum of money to a 18 or 19-year-old kid. So we can use that trust to have some different rules in there on how they can access the money, or even what it can be used for as a whole.
All right.
Yeah,
wonderful.
you can even add in there like milestones, which the recipient needs to hit in order to get a certain bit, or periodic installments instead of that lump sum. So the key is the flexibility, and who doesn't want something to be more flexible?
Right. So I would say in estate planning, when you're thinking about who's going to inherit this IRA account after your death, being able to set it up in a way that you're giving your beneficiaries the money in the way that you want them to receive it. Am I understanding that?
Yep, in the way that you want them to receive it. Exactly.
So how can a trust help protect my IRA assets and ensure that they are distributed according to my wishes?
So if you do fund, it's called funding the trust with the IRA. If you do fund your IRA into a trust, it's going to legally be subject to not only all the rules that you lay out in it, but it's also going to immediately be controlled by whoever you selected as your successor trustees. So assuming when you went through the process that we made sure we picked someone that we want handling that account and somebody that we trust, then we can be sure that they're gonna basically just be able to read exactly what you laid out and said, I don't want my kids to receive any of the money until maybe they've graduated college, or if they are going to access it, they can only use it for college. So we've got kind of a couple layers of protection there, so that we've got someone we know handling all of it and making sure that the rules are followed. So oftentimes beneficiaries don't even really necessarily have access to the money without at least one check stop or one signature that has to be done by whoever our trustees are.
And when it comes to the protection, are there any legal protections that comes with that, or is it solely the protection of being able to, give my beneficiaries the money when I want them to receive it?
The majority of the protection is going to come down to making sure it ends up where you want it. From the legal side, I mean, inside of an IRA, obviously the beneficiary designations are kind of covering the legal aspect of it for who is going to take it over. Really, what you'd have to be careful of is we are creating an extra step in the process. So it's another step where we have to make sure that we don't have any of those minor mistakes that unfortunately do happen in beneficiary designations. So we want to make sure that it's as transparent as it can be. But again, like I said, it can vary a little bit state to state. So like for you, Tabitha, I'd have to dive in and look at Florida specifically, but kind of like up in Michigan, at the end of the day, we're gonna get the IRA to our beneficiaries. We just need to make sure that we're doing it in the most efficient way possible. And that's oftentimes what a trust is accomplishing for us, is it's doing what we want in the most efficient way. Not that it's necessarily adding more legal protection, though.
I see. Okay. So what type of trust is recommended to be set up for this type of trust?
So there are two main types of trusts that people use today. That there are a variety. There's some special circumstances where we'd use some different kinds, but it's typically an irrevocable trust or a revocable trust. And then the latter, the revocable trust, tends to be the one that the majority of Americans are going with, because not many things in your life change at all when you get in a revocable trust. We don't have to give up ownership or anything like that, or give up control of our assets, which is what we tend to run into with an irrevocable trust. Is we're actually giving ownership to that trust right now, today, instead of with a revocable trust where it's going to take over ownership upon our passing. So the majority of people are using a revocable living trust. That way they can still, for example, if we want to sell our house and move when we retire, we're able to still do that as if we just owned the house without a trust at all. If we want to change our investments, if we do have our IRAs or things like that, they're not going to be tied up by the trust at all. And if we were in an irrevocable trust, then we start to have some different requirements for us to be able to change things that are owned by that trust. So we do have to have like our successor trustees sign off if we wanted to sell a house along with beneficiaries. In the revocable trust, we don't have any of those restrictions or anything. So it's typically the path that the majority of people tend to take, because then nothing really changes and they're still getting the benefits and the protection from probate and things like that.
What are those the main differences between the revocable and irrevocable trust? Can you explain a little bit about each of them and maybe the benefits?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess starting with the revocable trust, again, that's the key part is kind of when does ownership actually transfer into the trust? And so with a revocable trust, our successor trustee is the one who's kind of going to go activate that trust. And so when the two grantors or the grantor, if there's only one person, when they pass away, their trust then is going to legally take over ownership of the house, which is why it's not going to go to probate. It's going to take claim to any of the IRAs or life insurance accounts, anything like that. So then everything's going to kind of funnel into that trust today, where in an irrevocable trust, we'd be transferring ownership to the trust right now today. And so we're actually going in and getting an EIN assigned to an irrevocable trust. It's becoming a living entity, almost kind of like a business. If you started an LLC, it's a very similar idea. So we start doing tax returns for it every year. It's actually taking on some different tax liabilities and things like that while the grantor or whoever owns the trust is still alive. There are some benefits on the irrevocable side when we get into long-term care concerns are typically the ones that we talk to people about, especially in retirement. It's a pretty large concern for people that Medicaid is going to have to step in, and they're going to have spent down their assets to cover long-term care costs and kind of have their retirements wiped out. I'm sure you guys hear about this a lot. An irrevocable trust can be used to protect us from that a little bit, and it can kind of protect some of those assets from the government being able to step in or being forced to kind of spend those down before the Medicaid program steps in. That's usually the biggest benefit of the irrevocable trust. But again, hand in hand with that, the reason that we're able to protect it from having to spend it down for long-term care costs is because we've actually given up the ownership of it. And so then we've kind of lost a little bit of our control. So it obviously is very conditional to whatever fits right for an individual person, but there's a couple ways that people go there. And up in Michigan, I know, Tim, you talk to people about it all the time. The irrevocable trust and the long-term care concerns are one of the biggest concerns with anybody that we talk to.
And I think you hit on it when you said it, the individual, because it really does depend on the individual. And just by talking about the different types of trusts, I mean, there's a whole bunch of different subcategories as well, and that's why it's so important to actually talk to someone about it, because there's different subcategories of trusts that have different tax implications, asset protection implications. There's different trusts if you have special needs recipients in there as well. So it is something that it is recommended that you talk to someone who knows about this stuff and can help you kind of dive into the trust that is right for you, because it's not as simple as, oh, I need a trust, because there are different types.
A bunch of different requirements, right? All right. So is it possible for my beneficiaries to save on taxes by naming a trust as the beneficiary of my IRA instead of listing the individual directly?
So it's actually kind of the inverse of that a little bit. There's some things to be aware of. If we do leave an IRA a trust as the beneficiary of an IRA, there's a taxable event that's going to happen. It's going to happen within 10 years. So you're probably familiar, Tabitha, with the Secure Act rules, how that changed with inheriting IRAs a few years ago. So trusts are still subject to those rules. The tricky part that happens is that taxable event can either happen to the trust or to the estate, or it can happen to the individual. And so there's a variety of different ways we can make sure that we're having that taxable event happen in the right place. But if you take just even a simple look at tax brackets for estates, they're not very advantageous. We're going to pay if we do have a trust, and sometimes we have to have a trust take on some tax liabilities. It's just kind of the way it goes. But we don't want to do too much of that. And so if we are leaving traditional IRAs to a trust or to an estate as a whole, they're going to approach those higher tax brackets a lot faster than if an individual were to just inherit it. So then a lot of times what we want to look at doing is, how do we leave money in the most efficient way again? And so things like Roth IRAs are great for that, especially since that Secure Act came out. A lot of people have really started to look more and more at Roths and how Roth conversions can work. Not that it's wrong to leave money through a traditional IRA. That's how the majority of money in America is passed on to people. It's just we absolutely need to have a good understanding of how we're leaving it and why we're leaving it through a trust, so that we understand what the tax consequences are going to be.
Right, because I know for some people, it would be important for them to pay down the taxes. So, in the event that their beneficiary inherits it, there's less tax consequences. And for some people, they're like, "No, I would rather benefit because it's my IRA, and I would rather be the one paying less in taxes." So it's cool that different needs can be fit specifically to the individual and for the trust that they're wanting.
Again, that's one of the benefits of the trust. I mean, there is that flexibility, so you do get to control the distribution. So if you wanted it to come to get paid out lump sum, you could, there would be tax implications that way. But if you stretch it out and do the payments over a period of time, depends on how much the recipient is earning at the time, but that could affect them less than if it would have been a lump sum payment.
Right.
And would this include this trust that you guys are creating with the individual a will, or is that something that's separate?
So for us, that comes part of the package. So I'm sure we'll get to that. But as far as the estate planning package, it's included in that as well.
Yeah.
All right. So we kind of already went over this, but how can a trust provide control and oversight over the distribution of my IRA assets?
And this might even be easier to answer. I like to use myself as an example a lot for this. So before I was working in this industry, or before I really even knew what path I was going to take, my parents still always had a trust set up. They started doing estate planning right when they started having kids. And inside of their trust, I remember this conversation with them. They had rules on how their money could be spent if they were to pass away while we were still, really, it was under 22 years old. But if we were a kid still and they passed away, we weren't able to access any of the money until we were 22 years old, unless it was going to be used for educational purposes. So it laid out like tuition and room and board and things like that, so that we were able to access the money to go to college. Essentially was their biggest concern. And then after that, we didn't actually get any real payouts from the estate until we hit 25 years old. And so then it was a 50% lump sum that we were allowed to access at 25. And then the rest of it happened at 30 years old. And kind of like Tim was talking about how flexible or customizable an estate plan really needs to be. That was just how they went and customized it. We run into a lot of people who their biggest concern is, and again, using myself as an example, at 18 years old, if I were to go inherit $250,000, I probably would have had a pretty awesome 6 months, but I wouldn't have done good with money. So being able to push it out and kind of force me a little bit, which at 18 was what I would have needed. Making sure that you're actually using it for the right things, or if you are trying to leave a legacy, and make sure that everything you've built and worked really hard for is going to benefit your kids in the right ways, an estate plan comes into play hugely to accomplish that.
Yeah, I really like that. So what types of trusts are commonly used? We talked about the revocable and irrevocable trust. Is there any other ones that are able to be used, or are those the main ones?
Those those are definitely the main ones. The other one that we do run into a fair amount, Tim, I don't know how much you've worked with it. I've talked with some attorneys on what the right way to go about these ones are. If we do have anybody, or if there's clients or anything who have concerns and they have like a special needs child, that's the other one to be aware of. There's very specific trusts, and really there's specific attorneys who specialize in that world, because there are a lot of additional concerns and things we want to make sure that person's going to be taken care of no matter what. That's typically the third one that we end up talking to people about. If that's something that concerns anybody, there is a ton of information out there and ways that you can make sure that son or daughter or child or whoever that person is going to be well taken care of. And it goes even a little bit more in depth to make sure that guardianship is taken care of, depending on, different severities and things like that.
And the one of the main perks with the it's called an SNT, a special needs trust, is that it doesn't limit the government assistance. So even if there is something left in a trust to a special needs person, that income is not going to all of a sudden disqualify them for any type of government assistance that they're already receiving. So that's kind of one of the main reasons I think that one's used. But yeah, I've seen that once or twice.
That's amazing that they're able to set it up that way. So what are the potential drawbacks or limitations of using a trust as the beneficiary of my IRA?
Well, the biggest one and the probably the biggest mistake that we see, Tim, I think you'll probably agree with this, is when we were kind of jumping back to the tax question a little bit. If we are leaving a trust as a beneficiary, there's right ways to do it, or maybe there's really efficient ways to do it, and then there's less efficient ways to do it. I don't want to necessarily say it's the wrong way.
That's exactly what I had in my notes. It was not doing the research on the tax implications and knowing the right way to go about it tax wise.
Yeah, we do, and I have run into some horror stories sitting down with people where, they are inheriting a pretty big IRA, and the way it was set up and the way it was funded into that trust, basically the first 37% of that IRA got cut off the top in the first year.
Wow.
And so, we can make the argument like, well, you're still inheriting an IRA. It's not like you have to go to work to make that money. But if we're trying to be efficient, if we're trying to build a legacy, which is usually what we're talking about when it comes to estate planning, cutting 37% off the top isn't really doing anything to accomplish what our goals are. So there's things to be aware of. Like I said, making sure that we have a really thorough understanding of when these taxable events are going to happen, or if they're going to happen at all.
Yeah.
And would you guys, sorry, Tim, would you guys help the client, or would you guys tell them to go talk to a CPA or a tax professional at that point?
Yeah, it kind of depends on the complexity of it. We've got guys who work in the finance world. We're able to lean back on them a fair amount, but we always keep CPAs on retainer as well, because we do run into some tricky situations where we need to have, as professional of help as we can get to make sure that things are going to play out properly.
Wonderful.
I think one other drawback is setup cost. Setting up a trust or an estate plan, it's not free to do. And this is something I think where we've come in, and Security Benefit Center has kind of mitigated a lot of this. But you go to a typical estate planning agency, and you can pay, depending on the complexity of it, upwards of $5,000 to do an estate planning package, and then changes. Right, if you do one when you're fairly young, you're going to have life changes in your future. You can pay a lawyer $350, $400 an hour every time you want to change. What we try to do to mitigate and encourage younger people to start doing it is to solve that problem with the changes. So our full estate planning package is less than $2,000, and we never charge for any updates. So if you get that estate planning package and you get that trust set up when you are 30 years old, anything that changes, you have kids, you buy a new house, you start doing a different IRA, you can still make those changes to your trust, and it won't cost you anything. But depending on who you go through, there is setup costs, and that can be a turn off for some people.
All right. And what consideration should I be thinking about when I'm selecting a trustee for my trust?
Yeah, and we kind of just briefly touched on this a little bit. I talked about, we can feel like the trust is protecting everything as long as we've picked the right people to fill these roles.
The answer is in the question.
Yeah. The trustee, right?
Trust.
The person you trust.
That's someone you trust.
You absolutely want to make sure it's a person you trust. And we also want to make sure it's a person who's up for it, though. Not that it happens often, but a trustee, just because you're named as a trustee, doesn't necessarily mean you have to take the role on. So the bigger part, and the thing that I know, Tim, you and I both stress it to people all the time, but if you're getting an estate plan created, I always recommend to people that you should sit down with your successor trustee and kind of go through it with them and make sure they understand what you're doing and why you're trying to pass these things on, how you're passing them on. And I do the same thing with beneficiaries also. Make sure that if we are leaving to kids, they understand why you're leaving your assets in this specific way and how they're going to be able to access it, kind of what they can expect a little bit. Not that that's going to be the most exciting conversation.
Mhm.
It is kind of talking about death, but a fair amount of estate planning is kind of planning for the hopeful to not happen, hopefully to not happen. Um, but I think that transparency is pretty important when it comes to estate planning so that nobody's getting blindsided by any roles that they could be assigned to or different things that are being funded into the trust that they don't know how to handle or anything like that.
Yep. The whole point of this is to make everything easier for the trustee, and that doesn't work if the trustee is unaware that this is even happening. So, yeah,
Right.
don't let them be blindsided by this.
So in that event, would I be able to make myself trustee since it's my account and I know what's going on with it? Or would that be a bad idea?
You mean if it was your trust?
Yeah.
Yeah, then no, we wouldn't want to do that. Main reason being, then if you were to pass away, we wouldn't have a trustee to step in place to actually handle things afterwards. That would be a pretty quick way. There's some unfortunate examples that Tim and I both run into where we maybe did go get a trust set up and it didn't get set up properly or it didn't get funded properly, and a trust can end up in probate as well. And that's our worst case scenario. That's probably the number one thing that we hate to see, because then you've gone and possibly paid thousands of dollars to get this estate plan together and to try to do the right thing. And we probably actually just further complicated the probate process, unfortunately.
And that's how you end up with hundreds of billions in unclaimed assets across the country.
That's correct.
So what happens if the manager of the trust passes away?
By the successor trustee or the executor.
Correct.
So we like to have a contingent named, and this really does actually happen rather often because a lot of trusts aren't just settled in a couple of years. The trust might be set up to just provide income or something like that. And so we like to make sure we've got at least a couple layers of successor trustees and people who are going to be able to step in. And then kind of at the tail end of it, depending on how a trust is laid out, oftentimes a beneficiary will end up just taking control over it. That'd be several years down the road. But there's some different protections in there to make sure that we've got, and in case if a successor trustee or if an executor were to pass away before the grantors of the trust, we want to make sure that we've still got additional people named who would then be our next choice to take over control.
All right. How does naming a trust as the beneficiary of my IRA impact the RMD rules or the required minimum distribution?
Yeah. So again, kind of jumping back to that Secure Act, I'm sure you deal with that quite a lot. So now, we've got this 10-year window where we basically have to drain these IRA accounts. And so that the trust is going to be subject to those rules also. So that's, again, one of the considerations that we have to be making if we're leaving the trust, making sure we understand who's going to actually pay these taxes in these 10 years. And so a lot of times, and I think I've kind of talked to you about this before, Tabitha, doing things like Roth conversions or getting money into a tax-free space is a great way to alleviate those RMDs. Make sure that we don't run into, especially if we maybe didn't get them all done and we have a really large distribution that has to happen towards the end of a 10-year window. That's where we start to be at risk of that 37% figure coming off the top of whatever that distribution is. And it really just depends oftentimes on the size of an IRA that's being left. If we're leaving a $5,000 IRA, we're not going to get hit that hard with taxes. But if we're leaving $250,000 of money that's totally taxable as normal income, now we have to be careful because we are at risk of losing quite a bit of that off the top.
At 37% is a high percentage. Sounds
Yeah.
like a lot. How can a trust help provide for the financial well-being of my loved ones and ensure the longevity of my IRA assets? Kind of like we were talking about establishing the will and giving it to your beneficiaries when and how you want it. Anything to touch on here?
Yeah, I mean the biggest thing is what's nice is that trust is able to take an account over immediately. Nothing has to be frozen or be held up in probate or anything like that. And it's gonna, in being able to avoid some of that, one, give immediate access to the funds, which that can be a little bit of a speed bump for a lot of estates also. Something that Tim, I've heard you talk about it a dozen times. But making sure that there's accessible cash within an estate is pretty important. And that typically is going to come down to retirement assets and life insurance, those two assets specifically. And so being able to pass an IRA directly through whatever estate plan we've put together allows us to make sure that our successor trustees or our beneficiaries aren't going to have to cover any of the expenses out of pocket, because we are going to run into some expenses even with a trust or with a will. Regardless, if we're going through and selling homes and things like that, like we're gonna run into costs that have to be covered somewhere. And typically we want to figure out a way to alleviate any of the financial burdens off of our beneficiaries or trustees, and leaving an IRA like that helps a ton.
Wonderful. And how much does it cost to set up a trust and the maintenance costs around about?
So it depends on what company you go through. Obviously, I would say your average cost is probably you're looking at around 5 or 6 thousand. Maintenance cost depends on how often you change it, right? If you're gonna change it every 5 or 6 years, I'd say you're probably looking at probably $1,000 maybe each change. But it depends on who you're going through.
And if I do make changes to my trust, I don't have to create a whole new trust. I can just make amendments to the trust I already have established.
Correct. Yeah. Yep. No, you can just make amendments and updates into a trust. Yeah, kind of like Tim said, there's a couple different ways it can work. Oftentimes people are going directly to lawyers, getting an estate plan done. And so you're going to run into normal attorney fees. Usually there's some hourly per hour costs that you're going to run into there. It ranges. I mean, I've talked to a lot of people about what it costs to update theirs. It can be anywhere from a few hundred to a couple $1,000s to make updates. The only types of updates that ever require an entirely new estate plan is, number one, a lot of times if we maybe ended up divorced down the road, and we had a trust set up with our ex-spouse, or vice versa. If we got a trust set up for ourselves while we were single and then we got married, now we're completely adding or removing a grantor as a whole. And so then we might run into a situation where you do have to get kind of a whole new trust. And it's probably going to cost you, it can depend on what kind of relationship you have with the person who did it the previous time. If they'll help out with those expenses. But those are just a couple of the few examples where we might actually have to get an entirely new trust put together.
And if I had a child, would I just be able to add them as a beneficiary, or I would want to create a new trust at that point?
No, that one's really easy. Really, all trusts should be simple enough where we can add or remove or do simple updates to our beneficiaries. Those are really important changes, and ones that really everybody should feel encouraged to be doing, because our lives are going to change a lot. Nobody's going to have the exact same situation for 40 years through life, especially on the beneficiary side. As we get older, if we start to have grandkids and things like that, we probably want to make sure that they're listed in there, depending on how we would want the money to be left. So those are simple updates that really every couple of years or few years, if not every year, we should be at least thinking about and making sure we kept that trust updated with those.
All right. And for the people that are investing in real estate inside of their IRA, how can the trust benefit or the benefits of naming a trust as the beneficiary of the IRA with real estate investments?
So with the real estate investments, especially, there's some pretty interesting stuff you can do, especially on the tax side of things. So I know, Tabitha, you guys work with some different real estate types of investments and being able to hold those inside of actual retirement accounts. And on the tax side of things, when doing that, can be pretty advantageous to be able to not have to just completely sell off an asset altogether. You're probably pretty familiar with like 1031 exchanges and things like that. So we have a little bit more control now, even to be able to defer different capital gains taxes that we might incur. A trust is just going to additionally let us continue to do that. And so as we are liquidating money, we don't have to, like I said, kind of eat all those capital gains at one time. Again, like Tim said, we're able to kind of spread it out over time and not incur the really large 20% capital gains bracket. Maybe we can keep it in the 15 or even the 0% bracket.
All right. And what steps need to be taken to make a sale go through easily when a trust inherits a property?
So the biggest thing is making sure it actually inherits the property. Probably number one failure that happens in a trust is we go get a trust made and then we never redeed our property into the trust. So if we never do that, that trust is never going to take over ownership of that house. Not that we've wasted all of our estate planning money that we just spent, but usually the house is one of the biggest reasons that we're going to do that. So making sure that it is actually fully funded and it's fully funded properly are a couple of the most important things. And attorneys can help with that tremendously. They know exactly how it needs to happen. Redeeding a house is pretty simple. Most of the time it's done on just through the computer, and you can get all the information mailed right to you. That's usually the only other part also that does cost any money. It's usually something we like to make sure people are aware of. When you get into funding it, we can go change beneficiary forms and things like that. If you redeed a house, there are going to be some filing fees and things like that with the state that we run into. But making sure that mainly the trust has to actually be able to take over the ownership of that.
And without it being retitled on the deed, it never truly took ownership, correct?
Correct, yeah. And so that right there will trigger probate instantly.
All right. How much can clients expect to budget for the creation of a trust to be the beneficiary? We kind of touched over this. It's really just dependent on the type of trust that they're setting up, what requirements that are needed for the trust, and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So explain how a trust can help avoid probate and avoid public record.
Yeah, and so, kind of again, so if we can actually make sure that the trust takes over ownership, there's really only two paths that an estate is going to go. We can either not have an estate plan together, and then we're going to rely on probate to kind of give us legal access to the estate. So the house, for example, if we don't have it in the trust, probate's going to act as our trust now, or vice versa, really, because the majority of estates in America do end up in probate, unfortunately. So if the trust is able to take over ownership immediately, the only people who have access to the home or to any of the assets inside of it are going to be beneficiaries and our successor trustees. So instead of actually going into probate court where everything is completely public record, we've kept it private. We've kept it in the family. It's being passed through a successor trustee's control directly to our beneficiaries. So the only people who have their hands in it or really knowledge of it at all are the exact people that we got to go in and lay out when we got that trust put together.
And when it says avoiding public record, that's because probate is public record, or?
Yep. Yeah.
It's
probate.
It's a court, so anything court becomes public record, and it's visible.
And then everyone will be able to see the value that you're passing down to your beneficiaries.
Right.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much. That was our last question. Is there anything else that you guys would like to touch on before we wrap it up here today?
That's it. Thank you so much for having us, Tabitha.
Yes, thank you guys so much for being here. If you guys are interested in learning more, please reach out to us. We can get you in touch with the right people, and you can learn more about setting up your trust if that's something that's right for you. And please stay up to date with us on